My daughter and her husband forbade me from coming to dinner, so I canceled something far more important than a seat at their table. And what happened afterward set in motion a journey none of us could have predicted. Every choice I made, every step I took, led to a moment that would change everything. And the outcome will leave you wondering how one decision can shift an entire life. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. I am an old man who has carried the burden of sacrifice for more than 70 years, a father who poured his entire soul into raising a daughter after losing my wife far too soon, a man who worked until his body ached and his spirit nearly broke. Yet I never allowed myself to falter because her future mattered more than mine ever did. Through endless nights of exhaustion and countless days of labor, I held on to the belief that my devotion would one day be honored with love and respect. But life has a cruel way of exposing the truth. The moment it happened remains vivid, a wound carved deep into memory. The phone rang on an ordinary evening, yet what I heard on the other end changed everything. At first, my daughter's voice trembled, as though she was caught between duty and shame, speaking in half-finished sentences that carried no warmth, until he, her husband, took the phone from her and filled the line with his arrogance. His voice was sharp and unkind, each word falling like a blow as he told me I was not welcome at their dinner. He made it sound simple, as if I were a problem to be discarded, as if my presence at their table would taint their perfect gathering. Then he spoke the words that seared themselves into my heart forever. "This dinner is for family, not for burdens." I froze, gripping the phone so tightly that my hand ached, struggling to breathe as those words echoed in my head. Burden. That is what he called me. The man who had paid for the very roof over their heads. The man who had lifted my daughter out of every hardship life had thrown at her. The man who had been both father and mother when she needed both. And my daughter, my only child, stood in silence, allowing his words to stand as truth. When the call ended, I sat in my chair staring into nothing, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight I could not carry. Around me were the photographs of a lifetime, frozen smiles that once told the story of love and unity. There was the image of her in a graduation gown that I worked 3 jobs to afford, another of her blowing out candles on birthday cakes I bought with money I did not have, and another of her wedding day, the dress and reception financed with the savings I gave freely. Each picture mocked me now, reminders of sacrifices made in vain. For a while, I let despair drown me, wondering how a heart could be so ungrateful, how blood could turn so cold. Yet sorrow has a strange way of hardening into resolve. Slowly, a different fire lit within me, not the fire of blind anger, but the fire of clarity. I began to see not the daughter I had raised, but the woman she had become under the shadow of her husband's pride, a woman who had allowed love to be replaced with arrogance. They thought they had stripped me of my dignity, that I would accept this exile and sit quietly in the shadows of the life I had built for them. They were wrong. That night I whispered to myself a vow, spoken not in rage but in absolute certainty. I would not be erased. They would regret underestimating me. They would learn that forbidding me from a single dinner was not the end but the beginning. For when they locked me out of their table, they opened the door for me to take back everything they had ever taken for granted, and what I chose to cancel would not be a meal, but the very foundation of their comfort. When I first heard about the dinner, my heart was filled with a joy I had not felt in a long time, because it had been years since my daughter had invited me to any kind of gathering, and the thought of sitting at the same table with her and her husband gave me hope that perhaps the distance between us was finally closing, So I ironed my best shirt, polished my old shoes, and even thought about bringing a small gift as a token of my gratitude. Yet, I could not have known that beneath this invitation hid a humiliation that would cut me to the bone. At first, she spoke with a lightness in her voice, a tone that made me feel like I was part of her life again. And she told me they were hosting a dinner at their home, that people close to them would be there, and that I should keep the evening free, because she wanted me to attend. And in that moment I smiled to myself, thinking that perhaps she had not forgotten the man who had given her everything, the man who never failed to show up for her no matter the cost. For days I let the excitement build inside me, rehearsing conversations in my head, imagining the warm laughter that would fill the room, and feeling the glow of anticipation that perhaps my sacrifices were finally being acknowledged. But the dream was fragile, and it shattered just as easily as it was formed. Not long after, the call came, and the tone of her voice was not light anymore. It was clipped and uncomfortable, and I could hear him in the background, his low murmurs sharp as knives, guiding her words. She stammered at first, trying to explain why things had changed, until he finally stepped in and delivered the message himself. He told me with his usual smugness that it would be better if I did not come, that the gathering was meant for people who were close to them, and he emphasized that word close with a sneer that left no doubt about how he saw me. I tried to ask why, tried to understand what had changed from the invitation she had extended only days before, but he cut me off with the kind of tone that leaves no room for discussion. He said bluntly that the dinner was for family, not for someone who brought down the mood with his age and his stories, and then he laughed softly under his breath as if he had won some game at my expense. I could still hear her breathing on the line, the sound of her silence screaming louder than any word she could have spoken. And that silence was worse than his cruelty, because it meant she agreed, or at the very least, she would not stand up for me. The warmth I had felt when she first invited me was replaced by a chill that sank deep into my chest. I looked at the neatly ironed shirt I had laid out on my bed, the polished shoes waiting by the door, and they mocked me now with their readiness for an evening that no longer existed. The excitement I had nurtured turned bitter, as I realized that the invitation had not been an act of love or respect, but perhaps a slip of conscience, quickly corrected by the hand of arrogance. I thought about how eagerly I had prepared, how I had imagined myself once again in the role of a father welcomed with gratitude, and now that hope crumbled into dust. I sat there with the phone still warm in my hand, staring at the walls that had heard every sacrifice I ever made for her, and I felt the sting of rejection more deeply than any hardship life had ever thrown at me. The dinner I had longed for had turned cold before it ever began, and with it my heart hardened, for I knew then that I was no longer seen as a father or even as family, but as a burden to be hidden away. And though the humiliation burned, it also carved into me the clarity that would shape everything I chose to do next. When I think back on my life, the memories that rise to the surface are not of ease or luxury, but of nights where I dragged myself home from work with my body aching, of mornings when I left before the sun rose just to make sure there was food on the table, and of countless hours spent in silence as I labored for a daughter who was too young to know the weight I carried, because after her mother died, the entire responsibility of her future fell on me, and I swore to myself that no matter the cost, she would never feel the absence of a parent, even if it meant I would lose every piece of myself in the prior process. I remember the long nights standing behind a factory machine, the sound of grinding metal filling my ears, while my thoughts drifted to whether she was sleeping peacefully or whether the loneliness of not having a mother was pressing down on her. I would wipe the sweat from my brow and push harder, telling myself that each extra hour meant another bill paid, another meal on the table, another chance for her to grow without the shadows of poverty pressing in on her. When she was a child, I skipped meals so she would never know hunger. I wore the same pair of shoes until the soles nearly tore apart so she could walk proudly into school with new ones, and I denied myself every comfort so that she would never feel less than the children around her. I was both father and mother, protector and provider, never allowing her to see the tears that I shed when the loneliness became too much, never showing her the exhaustion that made my bones feel like stone. I remember her laughter when I came home late at night, the way her little arms wrapped around my neck, and in those moments all the fatigue melted away because I knew my sacrifices had meaning. As she grew older, the sacrifices did not lessen but only grew heavier. There were times when I worked 2 jobs at once, stumbling from one shift into the next, just to afford her tuition because I believed education would give her wings to fly beyond the life I had known. I still see myself sitting at the kitchen table late at night with bills spread out before me, counting coins and crumpled bills, figuring out how to make rent while also saving for her textbooks, and telling myself that if I had to starve, I would still find a way. Every decision I made was for her. I sold the small plot of land I inherited from my father so she could study in a better school. I gave up on the dream of retiring early so I could keep funding her needs, and I poured every ounce of my strength into a future I would never personally enjoy, but that she would. When she wanted a new dress for a school dance, I worked extra hours to buy it, watching her spin in front of the mirror with joy while I wore clothes so old they barely held together. When she wanted to travel with her classmates, I quietly sold my tools so she could go without feeling different. I bore every burden with pride, thinking that one day she would see, that one day she would understand that behind every success she enjoyed was a father who gave up his life so she could have hers. Yet now, as I sit in this house filled with memories, I realize those sacrifices have been forgotten, swept aside as though they were nothing more than the duties of a man easily dismissed. And it fills me with both sorrow and bitterness, because what is the worth of a lifetime of love if it can be erased by arrogance and silence? I gave her everything, and still she chose to let another man's voice define my place in her life. Money was never abundant in my life, but every cent I earned found its way into her hands, because from the moment she was born I decided that her comfort and security mattered more than my own. And as she grew older, the weight of that decision pressed harder on me, yet I never hesitated, never paused, never thought of myself first. I remember when tuition bills started to arrive, thick envelopes carrying numbers so large they made my stomach churn, but instead of shrinking back, I pushed myself into longer hours, overtime shifts, and side jobs that left me coming home long after dark, my body trembling with exhaustion. But the moment I saw her studying at the kitchen table with the lamp casting a glow on her determined face, I felt it was worth it. Rent was another battle, and though we lived in modest places, I made sure she always had a roof over her head, even if it meant bargaining with landlords, working odd tasks for them, or skipping payments on my own needs so hers could be met. There were times when she asked for money for groceries because her small part-time jobs could not stretch far enough, and I gave it without question, without judgment, because what father would let his child go hungry? Later, when she met the man who would become her husband, I was cautious, but I welcomed him for her sake, thinking that if he made her happy, then he would earn my support as well. And soon my wallet opened not just for her, but for the both of them. I remember paying deposits for their wedding, writing checks with trembling hands because the amounts were far greater than I could afford. But I convinced myself it was my duty to ensure she had the celebration she dreamed of. I stood proudly in the shadows that day, watching her smile, and though my bank account had been drained, I told myself the joy in her eyes was payment enough. After the wedding came the requests for help with rent, with bills, with unexpected expenses that always seemed to fall upon them, and each time I gave, sometimes draining my savings, sometimes delaying my own medical treatments, all because I thought family was worth more than money. I remember buying groceries for them and stocking their fridge when I visited, pretending it was nothing more than a small gesture, though it cost me much, because I did not want them to feel burdened by asking. I even co-signed a loan for them, knowing it could ruin me if they failed to pay, but trusting that they would honor my sacrifice. Each time I handed over money, I imagined them building a stronger future, a future where they would one day look back and say, "My father's sacrifices built the life we have now." Yet, instead of gratitude, I was met with entitlement. Instead of acknowledgement, I was met with silence, as though the flow of my support was not generosity but obligation. I can still hear the tone of their voices when they asked for more. No hesitation, no humility, simply expectation, as if it were their right to reach into my pocket whenever they pleased. I thought of the many nights I skipped meals to pay their rent, the times I wore the same coat through bitter winters while buying them new furniture, the times I canceled plans for myself so I could afford to help them through theirs, and I wondered if they ever truly saw the cost written on my weary face. It is a painful truth to admit, but the more I gave, the less they valued it, and what once began as acts of love turned into chains of dependence that they wore proudly while looking down on me. They forgot that every dollar had been earned with sweat, every sacrifice carved into my bones, and when they finally told me I was not welcome at their table, it was not only an insult to me as a father, but a complete erasure of the years of financial lifelines that had kept their world from crumbling. The first signs of entitlement did not arrive all at once like a storm crashing down, but rather like a slow leak in the roof that you ignore at first until suddenly the entire ceiling begins to sag and rot. And I remember clearly when I began to notice the change in my daughter's tone and the way her husband's influence started to shape her into someone I could barely recognize. It began with small, dismissive remarks, moments where she brushed off my advice as outdated or unnecessary, little sighs and rolling of her eyes when I offered to help fix something around their home, or when I suggested that saving money might be wiser than spending it on luxury. And though she never spoke the words outright, I could sense that she was embarrassed by my simplicity, embarrassed by the way I dressed in old clothes, embarrassed by the way I still counted every dollar carefully before parting with it. I told myself it was only youth speaking, that perhaps she was adjusting to adulthood and to the new influence of her husband. But deep down, I felt the sting of rejection slowly growing sharper. Her husband was not shy about his opinions. He carried arrogance like armor, and every conversation with him felt like a battle I was destined to lose. I remember one afternoon when I visited their apartment with bags of groceries, thinking I was doing them a favor, and as I placed the bags on the counter, he laughed quietly and muttered that I should keep my money for myself, because they would soon be living a life far beyond my understanding. My daughter giggled along with him, and though she quickly thanked me, the gratitude felt hollow, as though she were humoring me rather than truly appreciating what I had done. There were family gatherings where he would speak loudly about the future they planned, filled with vacations and expensive purchases, and I would notice how she sat beside him, nodding proudly, while never once acknowledging that much of their current stability still came from the sacrifices I was making behind the scenes. Slowly, her phone calls grew less frequent, and when she did call, it was usually to ask for something, a bill that needed covering or a deposit that needed to be made. And though I gave what I could, the warmth in her voice that used to melt my heart began to sound more like obligation than love. I noticed the way she no longer introduced me proudly to her friends, instead keeping me at a distance as though the life I had lived was a shameful reminder of struggle, something she wanted to bury beneath the image of success she and her husband were trying to build. One evening, I overheard them speaking when they thought I had already left the house, and I will never forget his words, dripping with contempt, when he told her that I was holding them back, that one day she would need to cut me out completely if they were ever to live the life they dreamed of. I stood frozen by the doorway, my heart pounding, waiting for her to defend me, waiting for her to say that I was the reason she had come this far. But all I heard was silence, followed by a soft agreement that shattered me more than his arrogance ever could. It was in that moment that I realized the girl I had raised was slipping further away, molded by his greed and pride, and though she still came to me when she needed something, her respect for me was crumbling piece by piece. Looking back, those were the cracks that foreshadowed the betrayal to come, the moments when entitlement began to replace gratitude, and though I tried to ignore it at the time, convincing myself that love would eventually overcome pride, the truth was already written in her dismissive tone and in his smug smile. I was no longer a father in their eyes, but a resource, a man to be drained of time and money until nothing remained, and once that shift had taken hold, there was no turning back. The day of betrayal is etched in my memory as though it were branded into my very soul, because it was not only the words that were spoken that wounded me, but the silence that followed, a silence that carried the weight of a lifetime of sacrifice dismissed in an instant, and I can still feel the heaviness in my chest when I think back to that phone call. It was early evening, and the house was quiet. The kind of stillness that often makes an old man like me restless. So when the phone rang, I felt a flicker of anticipation, hoping it was my daughter calling to speak with me, perhaps to invite me once more to the dinner I had been so carefully preparing for in my heart. Her voice came through the line, soft and hesitant, the way one speaks when they are about to wound but do not want to bear the guilt of the cut. And she mumbled something about changes, about how the dinner might not be the best time for me to attend, her words stumbling over one another like broken glass. I could hear him in the background, his voice steady and commanding, feeding her lines, pressing her to say what she did not want to say, until finally he grew impatient and took the phone himself. His words were sharp, dripping with contempt. And though I had grown used to his arrogance this time, he cut deeper than he ever had before. He told me clearly, with no attempt to soften the blow, that the dinner was for family and not for burdens, and as he spoke that final word, I felt something inside me collapse. Burden. That was what he called me. The man who had worked himself half to death to give his wife's daughter every chance at life. The man who had walked through fire to shield her from pain. The man who had never once hesitated to give when she asked, even when giving meant tearing another piece of flesh from his own bones. And she, my daughter, my only child, stood in silence on the other end of the line, listening to his cruelty without raising her voice to defend me, without whispering even a single word of protest. I waited for her to stop him, to say no, to tell him that I was her father and I would always be welcome. But nothing came, only silence, heavy enough to break me more than his insult ever could. My hand tightened on the receiver until my knuckles turned pale. My chest ached as though a weight had been placed upon it, and I struggled to find words, but none came because grief had stolen my tongue. When the call ended, I sat in my chair staring at the phone as if it were some cursed object that had just delivered the final verdict on my worth. Around me the house felt emptier than ever. The walls that once held laughter now echoing with a silence so cruel it seemed to mock me. I looked at the photographs on the shelves, the images of birthdays, graduations, and the wedding I helped pay for, each picture smiling back at me as though nothing had changed. And yet I knew in that moment that everything had. It was not just an invitation to dinner that had been taken from me. It was my place in her life, my role as father, my seat at the table of the family I had built with blood and sacrifice. I sat there long into the night, the shadows stretching across the room, asking myself over and over how she could allow it, how she could let another man speak to me that way and stay silent. And though my heart ached with grief, beneath that grief something else began to stir. The betrayal cut deep, but it also carved a space inside me where resolve could take root, a resolve colder than anger, sharper than sorrow, the kind of resolve that grows only when a man has been pushed past the limits of love. That was the day I understood the truth that would shape everything to come. I was not welcome at their table, so I would take away the very table they feasted upon. And in time, they would see that the man they called a burden still held the power to decide whether they stood or whether they fell. When the line went dead that evening and the house fell back into stillness, the silence around me grew so heavy it felt like a living thing pressing into my chest. And though I had endured many lonely nights before this one, never had the quiet felt so suffocating. Never had it carried such weight. For it was not the ordinary silence of an empty home, but the silence of abandonment, the silence that follows when those you have given everything to decide you are no longer worthy of love or respect. I sat in my chair for what felt like hours, the phone still clutched in my trembling hand, staring at the floor as though the wood beneath my feet could give me answers. And all I could hear was the echo of his voice calling me a burden, and the even louder echo of my daughter's refusal to speak in my defense. That silence was worse than any insult, because it told me that in her heart she had chosen him over me, that my sacrifices, my love, my years of devotion could be swept aside without hesitation. The photographs on the walls seemed to look down on me with cold stares, their frozen smiles mocking me, as if to remind me of what once was but could never be again. I tried to distract myself by turning on the television, but the noise only deepened the emptiness, so I switched it off and sat in the dark. The ticking of the old clock in the hallway, sounding louder with every passing second, each tick a reminder of the countless hours I had spent working for her, sacrificing for her, believing in her, only to be discarded in the autumn of my life. My eyes wandered to the old dining table I had built with my own hands decades ago, the table where she had once sat with her school books spread out, where we had shared simple meals and laughter, where she had blown out birthday candles while I clapped with pride, and now the sight of it made my throat tighten, because I knew I would not be sitting at her table because she no longer wanted me there. I rose from my chair and began pacing the room, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness, and I asked myself over and over what I had done wrong, what flaw in my character had turned me into something she could cast aside so easily. Had I not given enough? Had I not bled enough? Had I not already paid the highest price when I gave up every dream of my own so that she might have hers? The silence offered no answer, only deepened the wound. And with every step across that old floor, I felt the crushing weight of betrayal more acutely. At one point, I stopped before her graduation photo, the one where she wore her cap and gown and smiled so brightly, and I whispered aloud, asking if she remembered the nights I worked, double shifts just to afford the tuition, asking if she remembered the meals I skipped so she could eat well, asking if she remembered the father who had stood proudly in the crowd, clapping until his hands were sore. But the photo, like her silence, offered nothing in return. My chest ached as though the years of labor and sacrifice were pressing back against me, as though every choice I had ever made in her favor had been for nothing. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if I had been a fool to believe love could withstand the corrosive power of arrogance and greed. The silence in that house became unbearable, not because of the absence of sound, but because of the presence of betrayal it carried. And I realized then that it was not going to break, that it would follow me, haunt me, until I did something about it. And as I stood there in that crushing silence, surrounded by memories that now felt like ghosts, I felt sorrow harden into something colder, and though my heart still bled, my mind began to sharpen. And I knew the time had come to stop asking why, and to begin deciding how I would make them understand that a father's love may be silent, but it is not weak. And when provoked, it can rise from that silence with a power they would never see coming. As I stood in the silence of my home, my eyes wandered across the walls, the floors, the ceilings, and I was reminded of every nail I had hammered, every board I had carried, every corner I had painted. For this was not just a house, but the monument of my life's work, a place I had built piece by piece with my own hands. And the memories bound within it rose up before me like a tide determined to drown me in their weight. I remembered the early years when money was scarce, and time even scarcer, when I worked from dawn until nightfall, and still came home with just enough strength left to push forward on the construction of this house, because I wanted my daughter to grow up in a place that was hers, a place that would shelter her through storms and keep her safe from the world's cruelty. Every corner of these walls holds a memory of her childhood, her small footsteps echoing across the floors as she ran to greet me when I returned from work, her laughter filling the hallways as she played with toys I could barely afford, but gave her anyway, her voice calling for me in the middle of the night when the nightmares came, and I would rise from my bed to comfort her. I remember sanding these floors late into the night, sweat dripping from my face as I worked by the light of a single bulb, telling myself that if I could endure a little more pain, she would have a home where she would never feel less than anyone else. The roof I built kept her dry during storms, and I can still recall how she stood by the window as a little girl, watching the rain pour down, while I assured her she was safe inside because her father had built these walls strong enough to protect her. The kitchen held countless mornings where I prepared simple breakfasts before sending her off to school, and countless evenings where we sat together, eating meals made from scraps but flavored with love, and those moments gave me strength to continue no matter how exhausted I felt. I thought of the nights when I stayed awake fixing leaks, patching cracks, repairing what time and use had broken. And each repair was more than maintenance. It was a father's vow that she would never go without, that this house would never fail her. Even the yard outside told stories, the swing I tied to the old tree where she would laugh as I pushed her higher, the small garden we planted together, where she once told me she wanted to grow flowers just for her mother, who could no longer see them. And I held back my tears then, because I wanted her to remember joy, not sorrow. This house was never just wood and nails. It was a living testament to my devotion, a place where I poured every drop of my strength so she would always have a foundation to stand on. Now, as I looked at it in the quiet of betrayal, it felt hollow, stripped of warmth, And I asked myself how it was possible that the very girl who had once found comfort within these walls could now see me as a burden. The walls felt colder, the rooms larger and emptier, and the silence stretched through them like an accusation, reminding me that I had built a fortress of love only to be cast out from the very life it was meant to protect. I ran my hand along the grain of the wood on the doorframe, feeling the grooves I had carved when measuring her height year after year, each mark telling the story of her growing taller while I grew older. And now those marks cut into me like wounds, because they reminded me of the love I had invested in her growth, only to be abandoned when she reached the height of her own pride. I realized then that the house I built had stood loyal to her all these years, and so had I. But she had chosen to forget both, and though the weight of that truth crushed me, it also sharpened the steel of my resolve. Because if she could forget the foundation I built, I would remind her of it in a way she would never be able to ignore. As I stood in the house I had built with my own 2 hands, surrounded by memories that once warmed me but now cut like blades, I felt the grief inside me slowly transform into something harder, colder, and sharper. Because sorrow left unattended can consume a man, but sorrow harnessed with clarity can become the steel of resolve, and that is what began to take root in my heart on that night of betrayal. For hours I sat in the dim glow of the lamp, staring at the photographs of my daughter smiling in every stage of her life, each smile bought with my sacrifices, and the longer I stared, the less I felt like a broken father, and the more I felt like a man who had been blind for too long, a man who had allowed love to mask the growing arrogance of those he had raised and supported. I had carried the weight of her childhood without complaint. I had carried the financial burdens of her education and her marriage without hesitation. I had carried the insults and dismissive remarks that crept into her tone once her husband began shaping her view of me. And in return I was cast aside like a forgotten coat, told that I was not welcome at the very table that my money and labor had helped provide. For a long time I had accepted their coldness because I convinced myself that family was worth enduring every slight. But as I sat in the stillness of that evening, the anger that had once burned hot began to cool into something more dangerous, the quiet determination of a man who has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. I thought of all the times I had been too forgiving, too willing to excuse their behavior as immaturity or stress, and I realized that my willingness to endure had been mistaken for weakness. They believed that because I was old, because my back was bent from decades of work, because my hands shook from years of toil, I had no strength left to stand against them. But what they did not understand was that age had not weakened me, it had tempered me. The fire of youth burns bright and fast, but the fire of age smolders steady and unstoppable once it is fed. And that night I fed it with every memory of sacrifice dismissed, with every insult endured, with every silence from my daughter that cut deeper than a blade. I told myself that love without respect was not love, but slavery, and I would not spend the last years of my life bound by the chains of their arrogance. They thought they could forbid me from a single dinner, and that I would simply fade into the background, but I knew now that I would not only refuse to fade, I would rise with a strength they could not anticipate. I stood from my chair, my joints aching but my heart steady, and I walked through the rooms of my home with a new clarity. I realized that while they looked at me as though I were powerless, I still held more power over their lives than they even knew, because everything they had built was tied in some way to the foundation I had given them. Without my financial help, without the safety nets I had quietly secured for them, their perfect image of success would collapse, and for the first time in years I allowed myself to imagine what it would look like for them to feel the weight of betrayal, to feel the rug pulled from beneath their feet as I had felt when they denied me my place at their table. That vision did not bring me guilt, it brought me peace. Because it was not vengeance born of cruelty, it was justice born of truth. They had underestimated me, and that would be their downfall, because the man they saw as a burden was the same man who had built the ground they stood upon, and if I chose to take it back, there was nothing they could do to stop me. Once the fire of resolve had settled firmly within me, I knew that feelings alone would not carry me where I needed to go, because anger without action is nothing more than wasted breath. So I began the quiet work of turning my clarity into a plan, moving carefully and methodically, not letting a single soul know what I was preparing. I started by taking out the old folders I had kept tucked away in the cabinet. Papers that most people would overlook, but that held the true map of my involvement in my daughter's life and her husband's ventures. And as I flipped through bank statements, loan agreements, and property documents, the truth became clear. They had relied on me more than they ever admitted, and in many ways their carefully constructed image of independence was nothing but a facade built on the pillars of my sacrifices. I saw the co-signed loan I had once agreed to, the joint account where my contributions still provided a cushion, and the wedding contracts where my deposits had secured vendors that still waited for payments. I knew I needed guidance to make every move count, so the next morning I placed a call to my old lawyer, a man I trusted because he had seen me through difficult years when I almost lost the house to unpaid bills, and I asked him to meet me discreetly. When we sat down in his office, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books, I explained what had happened, and though his face remained professional, I could see the flicker of outrage in his eyes as I recounted how my daughter and her husband had humiliated me. He leaned forward, his voice calm but firm, as he assured me that I still had options, that I was far from powerless, and that in fact I held more leverage than they likely realized. With his help I began to trace the lines of dependence they had woven around me, and every thread I uncovered gave me strength, because I could see that their arrogance had blinded them to the reality that their future was still tied to my decisions. After meeting with the lawyer, I visited my banker, a woman I had known for years, who greeted me with kindness, but also with caution. As I explained, I wanted to review my accounts and reconsider where my money was going. She pulled up the records and showed me in black and white how often my funds had been used to cover their expenses, how many automatic payments linked back to me. And as I studied the numbers, I felt both a sting of betrayal and a surge of empowerment, because now I could see exactly how much they leaned on me even while pushing me aside. I asked her what steps I could take to close those doors quietly, to protect myself while also reclaiming what was mine, and she guided me through the options patiently, helping me set things in motion without drawing attention. I left that meeting with a stack of papers in my hand and a fire in my chest, because for the first time since the betrayal, I felt control returning to me. Each meeting, each quiet conversation with professionals who treated me with respect, reminded me that I was not the helpless old man they imagined, but a man with experience, knowledge, and resources. I told no one of my actions, not even old friends, because I wanted every step to remain hidden until the day came when the truth would no longer be deniable. At home, I sat at the same table where I had once helped my daughter with her schoolwork, but now, instead of math problems or essays, I spread out contracts and statements, marking each one with careful notes, drawing lines that led to the heart of their dependence on me. The more I studied, the more my resolve hardened, and the more I realized that justice would not come through anger or shouting, but through precision, through a plan executed so perfectly that they would have no time to prepare. Quietly, patiently, I was building the foundation of my response, and I knew that when the time came to reveal it, the silence that had once crushed me would instead be the silence of their shock as they watched the ground collapse beneath their feet. The more I dug into the records with the help of my lawyer and banker, the clearer it became that the very people who had labeled me a burden were standing on ground entirely held up by my sacrifices, and the irony of their dependence struck me like a cruel joke whispered by fate, because while they paraded themselves as independent, successful, and untouchable, the truth was that nearly every stone in their foundation had been placed there by me, the man they dismissed as unwanted. I discovered that the co-signed loan they boasted of managing so well was in fact being approved in large part because of my name and my credit, the history I had built through decades of disciplined payments, while theirs alone would never have secured such terms. I saw how the wedding vendors they still owed money to had extended deadlines because my deposits had reassured them that the final sums would eventually come. And I realized that without those initial payments, the grand day they loved to flaunt to their friends might never have happened at all. Even their rent, which they proudly claimed to cover themselves, had at times been quietly supplemented by my transfers. Money that kept the roof above their heads when they were too careless or too arrogant to admit they were short. Each revelation deepened my understanding of how much they had relied on me, and each one hardened my resolve, because while they had painted me as a man with nothing left to offer, they were blind to the fact that I was still the silent pillar keeping their image of success intact. I remembered the smug way her husband had told me I was not welcome, the dismissive tone in which he called me a burden, and I thought about how much of his pride was built on illusions funded by my sacrifices, and the taste of irony was bitter and yet strangely satisfying, because I knew then that the power he believed he had over me was nothing but smoke. My daughter, who once clung to me as her lifeline, now let this man guide her into arrogance. But she too was tied to me in ways she could not erase, because her education, her lifestyle, her very stability had all been purchased through the years of my labor. They strutted around with their heads high, speaking of future investments, vacations, and opportunities, while never once admitting that those dreams would shatter instantly if I decided to stop holding up the fragile scaffolding beneath them. As I sat in my living room with the documents spread out before me, I allowed myself a grim smile, because there was poetry in the fact that the man they wanted to cast aside was the same man who could topple their tower with the stroke of a pen. It was not revenge born from hatred, it was justice born from truth. A truth they refused to see, and the irony of it all made me more determined than ever to act. I thought of how they looked at me with pity, as though I were a relic of another time, someone to be tolerated rather than respected. Yet the very accounts they depended on still carried my name. The very credit they leaned upon was built from my discipline. The very safety nets they assumed were theirs by right existed only because I had woven them thread by thread. The irony was almost cruel, but it was also empowering, because it reminded me that the burden was never me, the burden was them, and I had carried it without complaint until they tried to strip me of dignity. That night, as I sat alone, I whispered aloud to the silence of the house that they had made a grave mistake, because by denying me a seat at their table, they had awakened the truth they had long ignored. And I promised myself that soon they would come to see the irony of dependence, not as a hidden truth, but as a reality they could not escape. Once the full weight of their dependence became clear to me, I knew it was time to transform knowledge into action, and I began to build a plan not with haste or blind rage, but with the patience of a man who has endured a lifetime of hardship and understands that true justice requires strategy, precision, and above all, silence until the right moment arrives. I started by closing the smallest doors first, the ones they would not notice immediately, but that would weaken the structure of their lives piece by piece. I canceled the automatic transfers that had been quietly covering their utility bills, small amounts that they had likely convinced themselves came from their own balance, and I redirected those funds into a separate account where I alone had control. Then I moved on to the larger supports, the co-signed loan that bore my name and reputation, and I instructed my lawyer to draft the paperwork to remove me from all responsibility, a process that would force the bank to evaluate their creditworthiness on its own. My lawyer smiled faintly as he explained that without my name, the terms of that loan would collapse, and I felt a grim sense of satisfaction knowing that the arrogance they had so proudly wielded would soon be tested by reality. I revisited the wedding contracts, where my deposits had held vendors in good faith for balances that were still unpaid, and I withdrew my guarantees, leaving those businesses to demand full payment from my daughter and her husband alone. I contacted my banker and closed the joint account where my contributions had acted as their hidden safety net, transferring every cent into my personal savings, and I instructed her to ensure no further access would be permitted to anyone but me. Each step I took was deliberate, each decision executed with the calm focus of a man who knows that vengeance is most powerful when it arrives, not with shouting, but with silence, the kind of silence that leaves the guilty scrambling in confusion. At night I sat at the same table where I once taught my daughter how to balance a checkbook, reviewing the progress of my plan, writing notes in the margins of contracts, and I could almost hear her laughter from those days echoing in the back of my mind, a cruel reminder of how far she had drifted, but instead of weakening me, it fueled me further. I thought of her husband's words, calling me a burden, and with every canceled payment, with every withdrawn guarantee, with every severed tie, I whispered to myself that the burden had always been theirs, and now it was time for them to carry it on their own shoulders. I told no one what I was doing, not friends, not neighbors, not even my closest confidants, because I wanted the revelation to fall like a storm out of clear skies, leaving them no chance to prepare. My lawyer guided me through the final steps, ensuring that everything was legally sound so that when they realized what had happened, they could not accuse me of rashness or illegality, but only of reclaiming what was mine. It struck me then how ironic it was that the very discipline and attention to detail that they mocked in me as old-fashioned would now become the tools of their undoing. With every action taken, I felt a weight lifting from my chest, as though each canceled payment was also a cancellation of the humiliation they had tried to place upon me. I was no longer the man sitting in silence, crushed by betrayal. I was the man quietly weaving the threads of justice into a net that would soon fall upon them. And as I prepared the final pieces of my plan, I realized that the day of reckoning was approaching swiftly, and when it came, they would not be able to pretend I was irrelevant, because the life they believed was theirs had always been mine to give and mine to take back. The night of their grand dinner arrived, the very one from which I had been forbidden, and though they likely imagined me sitting alone in sorrow, perhaps weeping at my exclusion, the truth was far different. For while they dressed themselves in fine clothes and welcomed guests into a home filled with laughter and false pride, I sat quietly at my own table, surrounded not by pity but by papers, documents, and the silent power of decisions that would soon reshape their lives. I had prepared a modest meal for myself, nothing extravagant, just enough to fill my stomach, and as I ate slowly, I thought about the irony of it all, that they believed barring me from their table was the ultimate insult, when in reality it was the gift of solitude that allowed me to finish the work I had begun. The lamp on my desk cast its glow over the neatly stacked contracts and letters, each one a blade sharpened to precision, and I signed the last of the withdrawals that severed my support from them, my pen gliding across the paper with the steadiness of a man at peace with his choice. I canceled the final standing orders that had once funneled money into their accounts, and I drafted the notices that would alert their creditors that my name and guarantees no longer stood behind them. Every signature I placed was not merely ink on paper, but a declaration that the foundation of their lifestyle no longer belonged to them. As I worked, I thought of the guests at their dinner clinking glasses, smiling at the illusion of prosperity my daughter and her husband had crafted, and I could almost hear the smugness in his voice as he likely toasted to their success, never suspecting that even as he raised his glass, the walls of his false kingdom were already crumbling. I imagined her sitting at that table, perhaps sparing not a single thought for the man she had excluded, and though the image pained me, I reminded myself that this was the choice she had made, and choices carry consequences. By the time I set my pen down and gathered the signed papers into envelopes, I felt a calm settle over me, unlike anything I had known in months. Outside, the night was still, and I stepped onto the porch of the house I had built long ago, breathing in the cool air, looking at the stars that had witnessed every sacrifice I had ever made. I whispered to myself that justice was now in motion, that by the time their dinner laughter faded into morning silence, they would already be standing on hollow ground. There was no need for me to storm into their gathering or shout at them across the table, because my vengeance was not in words but in actions they could not undo. I returned inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat in the quiet of my home with a peace I had not felt since before the betrayal, because for the first time I was not merely enduring their arrogance, I was reclaiming my power. The night they believed would humiliate me became the night I delivered the final strokes of their undoing, and though they would not know it yet, by excluding me, they had ensured that their celebration would mark the beginning of their downfall. As I closed my eyes and let the silence of my house embrace me, I no longer felt like the unwanted old man they imagined. I felt like the architect of their fate, and I knew that when the morning came and the first cracks appeared in the facade of their life, they would finally begin to understand what it meant to call a father a burden. As I sat in the calm of my home, finishing the final strokes of my plan, I could not help but imagine what was unfolding across town, because I knew my daughter and her husband were hosting the dinner with all the pride and smugness of people who believed they had triumphed over me. And in my mind, I could see the way he raised his glass with that self-satisfied grin, the way she smiled politely while basking in the approval of guests who knew nothing of the truth behind their show of success. I imagined the table set with polished silverware and dishes chosen to impress, the wine flowing freely as laughter filled the air, and I pictured the two of them sitting at the head as though they were royalty, playing the part of hosts who had built everything on their own. I knew his words would be loud and boastful, full of stories about business ventures he claimed to have secured, about the bright future they had before them, and I knew she would nod and smile, letting his arrogance speak for them both, even as she stole glances at her guest to make sure they admired what they saw. I could almost hear the laughter as he joked about burdens, perhaps even about me, dismissing the old man who had been excluded from their circle. And I felt the sting of those imagined words, but instead of breaking me, they fueled the quiet fire of satisfaction, because I knew that while they paraded their arrogance before others, the very ground beneath them was already gone. Their smugness was built on illusions funded by my years of sacrifice. Illusions I had quietly dismantled piece by piece while they congratulated themselves on a victory they had not earned. I pictured him, leaning back in his chair, perhaps bragging about the stability of their finances, perhaps speaking of future trips or purchases, while the unpaid bills sat hidden in drawers and the creditors waited silently for balances still due. And I thought of how easily that smug smile would vanish once the notices began to arrive. I imagined her forcing laughter at his jokes, her silence echoing the silence she had given me on that fateful call. And though the memory of her betrayal still burned, I reminded myself that her silence would soon be broken, not by me but by the weight of consequences she could no longer ignore. I envisioned their guests complimenting the dinner, praising the food, remarking on the beauty of the home, never knowing that much of it was sustained by money that no longer flowed, by guarantees that no longer stood, and I took grim pleasure in the thought that the very image they sought to uphold would soon shatter before those same people. While they laughed and toasted, I sat with my coffee cooling beside me, calm in the knowledge that justice does not always strike loudly but sometimes arrives in silence, weaving its way into the lives of those who thought themselves untouchable until the ground gives way beneath them. The smug celebration they enjoyed that night was their last moment of unbroken pride, and though I was not there to see it, I did not need to be, for I knew how quickly smugness turns to fear when the truth arrives uninvited. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet hum of my old house, and I felt no sorrow for missing their dinner, because what they had denied me was nothing compared to what I had taken from them. Let them celebrate, I thought. Let them laugh and boast, because every smile that night was a step closer to the realization that they had mistaken the silence of an old man for weakness, when in truth it was the silence of preparation. And soon their smug celebration would be remembered not as triumph, but as the final feast before the fall. The days that followed their smug celebration were the beginning of the unraveling, and though I remained in the quiet of my home, far from their laughter and boasts, I knew the moment of consequence had arrived, when the first cracks in their perfect image began to show, because I had pulled away the supports they had so carelessly relied upon, and now the weight of their arrogance began to crush them. It started with the wedding vendors, who, after waiting patiently for balances they had expected me to guarantee, suddenly sent notices demanding immediate payment, and I imagined the panic on their faces when they realized the deposits I had made were no longer holding the debts at bay. Soon after, the bank reached out with new terms for their loan, terms no longer softened by my name, and I pictured her husband reading the letter with disbelief, his smug grin fading as he tried to comprehend how quickly their supposed security had turned into a mountain of obligations. The utility bills that had always been paid on time began to pile up, and I could see in my mind the growing frustration as they scrambled to understand why money was not stretching as far as it once had, why the safety nets they had taken for granted had vanished into thin air. Their calls to creditors grew desperate, their tone shifting from arrogance to pleading, and though I was not there to hear their voices, I knew the sound of panic well, for it is the sound of people who have built castles on sand and now watch the tide sweep in. I thought of my daughter sitting at the kitchen table late at night, papers spread before her, her eyes filled not with pride but with confusion and fear, and I wondered if in those moments she remembered the countless nights I had done the same for her, only without complaint, without expecting anything in return except her future. Her husband, so full of bluster, no doubt raged at the walls, cursing the unfairness of it all, never realizing that fairness had nothing to do with it, that what he faced was simply the truth finally standing before him. Each bounced payment, each collection notice, Each phone call from a lender chipped away at the facade they had worked so hard to display at their dinner. And though I was miles away, I could almost hear the silence settling between them as the weight of reality pressed down. Friends, who had admired their show of success, now began to question, whispers of doubt spreading quietly. And I knew that soon the humiliation of exposure would sting more than the bills themselves. The reveal of consequences is never immediate. It is a slow tightening of the rope, and I allowed myself the grim satisfaction of knowing that every hardship they faced now was one they had brought upon themselves by spitting on the hand that had fed them. I did not need to lift a finger anymore, for the work was already done, and justice was unfolding exactly as I had intended, silently and relentlessly. In the stillness of my home, I poured myself another cup of coffee, listening to the clock tick steadily, and I thought of how different the silence felt now compared to the night of my betrayal. Back then it had crushed me, but now it comforted me, because I knew that while they once silenced me, now they were the ones silenced by fear and regret. The reveal of consequences had only just begun, and though they had not yet reached out to me, I knew the day was coming when the first call would arrive, when their voices would tremble not with arrogance, but with desperation, and I was ready to hear it. It was only a matter of time before the silence between us shattered, and when the phone finally rang, I already knew it would be her voice on the other end, no longer steady with indifference, but trembling with the weight of desperation. And though I had imagined this moment countless times since the night of betrayal, hearing her plead with me still stirred emotions I could not easily contain, for she was my daughter, and the sound of her brokenness reminded me of the child I had once held in my arms. Yet the memory of her silence, when her husband called me a burden, kept me firm as steel. Her words came fast, frantic, stumbling over themselves as she explained how everything was falling apart, how the bills were piling higher than they could manage, how creditors were calling day and night demanding payments, and how her husband's proud talk had turned to fury and blame as their carefully built image began to crumble around them. She begged me to understand that they had not meant to push me away, that perhaps it was a misunderstanding, that they still loved me and needed me, and though I listened quietly, I could hear the shift in her tone, the false sweetness she used to soften the plea for help, a sweetness I had learned to recognize over the years when requests for money came disguised as love. I sat there gripping the receiver, my heart torn between the instinct of a father who wanted to protect his child and the resolve of a man who had been humiliated and cast aside, and I let her speak, every word dripping with regret that came not from conscience, but from consequence. She told me how her husband had promised they would manage without me, how she believed him, how now he was furious that their plans had unraveled, and how she did not know where else to turn. I could almost see her sitting at the table, papers scattered, tears streaking her face, the weight of panic pressing down on her. And I thought of the countless times I had sat in that same position, but without anyone to call, without anyone to catch me when I fell. And I wondered if she remembered those years when I bore the load alone for her sake. When I did not immediately answer, her voice cracked, and she said she was sorry, that she should have spoken up, that she should have defended me. And for a moment, my chest ached with the memory of her, as a little girl clutching my hand in fear of storms. But then the truth of the present swept over me like ice water, reminding me that her sorrow now was not born from love, but from need, that her desperation was not for her father, but for her safety net, the one she and her husband had mistaken for weakness. I could feel her waiting on the line, hoping that the silence that stretched between us would give way to the old father who always rescued her. But instead, I remained still, offering nothing, because I had learned that sometimes the most powerful answer is silence. That silence grew heavier with each passing second, and I knew she felt it, because her breathing grew uneven, her words faltered, and then at last she whispered my name in a way that sounded less like love and more like defeat. I closed my eyes, holding the receiver to my ear, and let the silence do what years of sacrifice could not, because only through consequences would she come to understand that a father is not a burden, but the foundation upon which she had stood all her life. When I finally lowered the receiver, I did not feel guilt or regret, only a steady calm, for I knew that my silence had spoken louder than any words of comfort could, and that her desperation was only the beginning of the lesson she and her husband would soon learn in full. The confrontation I had known would come did not take long to arrive, because desperation eventually demands a face-to-face reckoning, and one afternoon they appeared at my door, my daughter with tears in her eyes, and her husband with the same arrogance in his stance, though now cracked with frustration. And as I opened the door and let them in, I felt a strange calm wash over me, the calm of a man who knows he is no longer the one on trial, but the one who holds judgment in his hands. They sat across from me at the table I had built decades ago, the same table where she once did her homework under my watchful eye. And the irony of it was not lost on me. As I watched her stare down at its surface, unable to meet my gaze, while her husband tried to fill the silence with bluster. He began to speak loudly about misunderstandings, about how things had been taken out of context, about how I should not be so quick to cut ties because family needed to stand together. But his words carried no conviction, only the hollow sound of a man trying to cling to control he had already lost. I let him talk, my hands folded calmly before me, and when he finally paused for breath, I looked directly into his eyes and told him in a voice steady and unwavering that I had heard every word he spoke on that phone call, that I remembered clearly how he called me a burden, and that I would not allow him to twist the truth now. My daughter lifted her head then, her eyes wet with tears, and she tried to plead with me, her voice softer, begging me to understand that she had only stayed silent because she was afraid of conflict, that she had never meant to hurt me, that she still loved me, and for a moment my heart ached at the sight of her breaking before me. But I remembered that love without respect is hollow, and I could not allow myself to be moved by words that came too late, so I spoke the truth they needed to hear. I told them that when they forbade me from coming to their dinner, I in turn canceled everything they owed to me, that every safety net they had relied upon was gone, because they had chosen to treat me as disposable. I told them that the house they lived in, the loans they depended on, the bills they ignored, had all stood because I had carried them, and that I had every right to withdraw my support when they chose to erase me from their lives. My daughter wept openly then, clutching her hands together, while her husband's face flushed red with fury as he tried to protest, calling me vindictive, calling me cruel. But his words fell flat, because the truth hung heavy in the air, and he could not deny the consequences now crushing them. I leaned forward, my voice low but sharp, and I reminded him that arrogance had led him to believe I was weak. Yet the reality was that I had been the strength behind their illusion all along, and by rejecting me, they had destroyed the very foundation beneath their feet. The room grew still after that, the silence no longer mine to carry but theirs, and I watched the weight of truth settle over them like chains. My daughter whispered that she was sorry again, but I did not answer with comfort, only with the calm certainty of a man who has reclaimed his dignity, because I knew that pity now would only undo the lesson they needed to learn. The confrontation ended not with shouting or violence, but with the undeniable truth laid bare between us, and as they rose to leave I saw in their faces the collapse of pride, the shattering of illusions. And though part of me mourned the loss of the bond we once shared, a greater part of me felt peace, because at last I had spoken the words they could never take back. And at last they knew that the father they cast aside was not a burden, but a man who had chosen to take back what was always his. When they left my house after that confrontation, I could see the weight of truth clinging to them like shadows, and though they tried to mask it with hurried words and stiff shoulders, I knew the illusions they had so carefully built were already collapsing under the pressure of reality. For arrogance cannot stand when its foundation is stripped away. I imagine the ride back to their home, my daughter staring out the window in silence, her heart torn between guilt and anger, while her husband raged beside her, blaming everyone but himself, yet knowing deep down that his pride had led them to this ruin. In the days that followed, word began to spread quietly among their friends and acquaintances, because whispers have a way of finding ears, and the stories they once told of success and independence began to falter when creditors called during dinner parties, when collection letters arrived in plain envelopes, when vendors who had once been patient now demanded answers. The people who had once looked at them with admiration now began to glance with suspicion, and I knew the sting of humiliation would cut deeper than any financial burden. For my daughter, the illusion that her husband could carry her into a life of prosperity without my help shattered completely, and I pictured her sitting alone late at night, tears staining her face as she realized that the very man she had trusted to protect her pride was the same man who had dragged her into disgrace. For him, the illusion of control and superiority crumbled as he scrambled to explain why everything was unraveling, his voice losing its confident tone, his eyes losing their gleam of arrogance, and I could almost hear the venom in his words as he lashed out at her, at creditors, at fate, never daring to admit that he himself was the architect of their downfall. The home that once seemed full of confidence must have grown cold with tension, their arguments echoing through the walls. Every word a reminder that their kingdom was nothing more than a facade built on my back. My daughter, torn between the loyalty she felt toward her husband and the regret she felt toward me, must have found herself standing in the ruins of her choices, forced to face the truth that silence in the moment of betrayal had cost her more than she ever expected. I thought often of her eyes at my table during the confrontation, wide and filled with tears, and though I still loved her as only a father can, I knew love could not mend what pride had broken. The shattering of their illusions was not only financial but also personal, for the image of themselves they had worked so hard to maintain in front of others was destroyed, and there is no arrogance that can survive the weight of public humiliation combined with private despair. I knew they must have felt the ground beneath them shake as each piece of support vanished, and I also knew they must have finally understood that the man they had cast aside, the one they called a burden, had been the very reason they stood so tall for so long. And though part of me wished it had not come to this, another part knew it was necessary, because sometimes the only way to strip away arrogance is to let illusions shatter so completely that they can never be rebuilt. As I sat in my quiet house, sipping my coffee in the evenings, I thought about how different the silence felt now compared to the silence of betrayal. Back then, it crushed me, but now it comforted me, because I no longer bore the weight of their dismissal. That weight was theirs to carry, and with every passing day their shoulders bent further under it, their illusions lying in pieces around them, and I knew that even if they tried to rebuild, they would never again see me as powerless. For the truth had already been carved into their lives, and nothing could erase it. Vindication does not always arrive with cheers or applause. Sometimes it comes in the form of quiet certainty that justice has been served. And as I sat alone in my home, reflecting on everything that had transpired, I felt that certainty settle deep within me like a long-awaited peace, because for the first time since the night of betrayal I no longer carried the weight of humiliation. Instead, I carried the knowledge that the truth had been spoken and lived out before their eyes. When I looked back on the confrontation, I remembered the silence that followed my words, the way her tears fell as if she finally understood what she had lost, the way his face twisted with fury because he could not deny the reality I laid bare. And in that silence, I found my vindication. I thought of every night I had worked until my hands bled, of every dollar I had given without hesitation, of every moment of sacrifice I had endured so she could live without fear. And though those memories once brought me pain, now they became the very evidence of my righteousness. They had called me a burden, yet the collapse of their illusions proved to everyone, and even to themselves, that I had been the strength all along. I did not need to shout my worth. I did not need to force apologies from their lips, because the truth of their dependence and the consequences of their arrogance had already spoken louder than I ever could. For my daughter, I hoped that the regret carving itself into her heart would one day become understanding, that she would see her father not as a relic to be dismissed, but as the man who gave her life everything she cherished. And though it pained me to know she had to learn through loss, I also knew it was the only way she could truly see. For her husband, my vindication was watching his pride dissolve, watching his bluster fall silent when faced with the reality that his confidence had always been borrowed from me. And I felt no sorrow for his downfall, only the quiet satisfaction of balance restored. Vindication came, too, in the whispers that circled back to me. Stories of how their friends now questioned their stability, how creditors no longer gave them the benefit of doubt, how their once proud reputation had cracked in the eyes of others, and I realized then that humiliation had returned to its rightful owners. But most of all, vindication came from within, from the calm that filled me when I looked at the life I had built, and understood that while they had chosen arrogance, I had chosen strength, and strength had prevailed. I was no longer the man crushed by betrayal. I was the man who reclaimed his dignity, and in that reclamation I found a deeper peace than I ever expected. As I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at my old table, I whispered aloud to the silence that had once mocked me, telling it that I was no longer afraid, because silence was no longer the sound of abandonment. It was the sound of victory. I had proven to them and to myself that respect cannot be demanded by those who refuse to give it, that love without honor is empty, and that even an old man cast aside still has the power to stand tall. My vindication was not in their suffering, though I knew they suffered, but in my own freedom, the freedom to live the rest of my days without the chains of their entitlement, the freedom to know that I had done all I could as a father, and that what followed was no longer my burden to carry. In that freedom, I found peace, and in that peace, I finally felt whole again. In the quiet that followed the storm, I found myself sitting once more in the home I had built, the same walls that had witnessed every sacrifice and every heartbreak, but now, instead of sorrow pressing down on me, I felt an unfamiliar calm, a sense that the weight I had carried for so long had finally been lifted, because I no longer lived beneath the shadow of their arrogance or the sting of their rejection. My days became slower, filled with simple routines, the brewing of coffee in the morning, the tending of the small garden outside, the gentle rhythm of a life lived for myself, rather than constantly given away to those who could not value it. At first I thought the silence of the house might return to mock me, but instead it embraced me like an old friend, reminding me that peace is not found in noise or gatherings, but in the steady beat of a heart that knows it has done what is right. I reflected often on the journey that had brought me here, on the years of sacrifice, the years of being taken for granted, the years of enduring insults masked as casual remarks. And though those memories could still sting, they no longer defined me, for I had reclaimed the dignity that had been stripped away. My daughter and her husband continued to live in the ruins of their own choices, and while part of me wished she would come back to me with true remorse rather than desperation, I also understood that her path was hers to walk now, just as mine was mine, and I no longer felt bound to rescue her from every stumble. I had learned the hardest truth a parent can face, that love without respect is hollow, and that even the deepest devotion cannot survive if it is met with betrayal. Yet in accepting that truth, I also discovered freedom. Freedom to live the last chapter of my life with pride rather than shame. Freedom to enjoy the fruits of my labor rather than watching them drained away by entitlement. And freedom to rest, knowing that I had done all I could and more. I often walked through the rooms of my house, running my hand along the wood I once hammered into place, and instead of bitterness, I felt gratitude that the strength in these walls had outlasted the weakness of their choices, and I whispered to myself that this house had always been a symbol of my resilience, and so was I. The peace I felt was not loud or dramatic. It was steady, like a river that flows long after storms have passed, and in that steadiness I found my resolution. I was no longer the man excluded from a dinner. I was the man who had chosen to reclaim his place in his own story, and in that choice I had triumphed. And now, as I close this chapter of my journey, I want to leave you with this final thought. Respect cannot be demanded by those who refuse to give it, and dignity belongs to those who choose to claim it. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.